This is Segue, a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of Southern Illinois University Edwardsville.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Segue, the show that allows us to talk about issues and ideas here on the campus of Southern Illinois University Edwardsville. I'm Kevin Leonard, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm very pleased to be here today with SIUE alumna and author Erin Litteken. Erin earned a bachelor's degree in history with a minor in English from SIUE in 2003 and recently published her debut novel, The Memory Keeper of Kyiv. The book was featured in Fortune magazine's list of 10 new page-turning novels you should read this summer and has already been translated into 13 languages. The novel is set in early 1930s Ukraine and was inspired by the stories told by her late great-grandmother, a Ukrainian refugee. Welcome to Segue, Erin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, let's begin by having you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself. Where did you grow up and how did you end up studying history at SIUE?
I grew up in a small town an hour south of Chicago on a little hobby farm, and I fell in love with the rural campus of SIUE. I loved it. I felt very at home here with the rolling hills and the nature, and so I applied and I ended up getting a Chancellor Scholarship, and so that kind of made it pretty clear that this would be a good place for me. It was a natural fit, and I loved my time here.
Well, that sounds great. So, you grew up on a little farm, and then you were attracted to the more or less rural nature of the campus.
Yeah, I felt very comfortable with that.
That sounds wonderful. How did you become interested in writing?
I have always loved writing, and I think that probably stems from my love of reading at a very young age. I actually just found a book I wrote when I was 6 years old, complete with like duct tape binding and crayon illustrations. So it's been a part of my life for a really long time. Oh, wow. So, and what led you to gravitate towards history in your studies? That's been my passion forever. I just love history. And so, especially this type of history that's related to my family. And so, as I got older, I knew I wanted to do something with history in my life.
Okay. Now, was there some experience or set of experiences that led you to realize that you could become an author?
I mean, it was always a pipe dream. You always kind of think you could do it and want to do it. I think realizing that nothing else would make me happy was what the driving force, but then making it happen isn't always as easy as that.
Sure.
So.
Now, what did you do after you graduated and before you published the novel?
So I actually worked at the Stevenson House for a while as the assistant director. That Living History Museum there, and I worked at the Missouri History Museum for a little bit, and then I tried a couple different things, but nothing really fit with what I wanted to do to fulfill me till I found merging writing and history together was really my passion.
Okay. Now, were there specific individuals at SIUE who inspired you here during your time as a student, faculty members, other students?
Yeah, definitely. My mentor was Dr. Ann Valk, and she was wonderful. She really opened my eyes to looking at history more critically, thinking about it in different ways, and so that was really wonderful. Dr. James Weingartner was my historical methods teacher, and the research skills I learned in that class were really valuable to how to really look at a primary source or any type of document and realize the bias there and understand that history is always written by the victors, so you really have to look at it with a well-rounded eye and glean from it what you can without being biased.
Yeah. So I mentioned also you were an English minor. So how did the history major and the English minor work together to prepare you to be an author?
Well, it definitely brought those skill sets to the forefront of what I wanted to do. So the research and critical thinking was huge with the historical background there. And with writing, I did take a creative writing class, an independent creative writing class my last year. And that was really helpful too. I worked one-on-one with a teacher who kind of introduced me to the fact that writing creatively is a craft and there's different ways to look at it, not just sit down and spew out words, but there's ways to structure it to make it more appealing to readers. And so that was kind of the beginning for me on that path. Okay.
Well, tell us a little bit about how you came to publish this novel. Where did the idea come from, and when did you start working on it?
So I started working on this novel probably 10 years ago. It's been a long time coming around work and children and life. So I did it on the side when I could. And It was something that stemmed from my love of my family history. My Ukrainian great-grandmother lived with us when I was a child, and I heard a lot of stories about life in Ukraine. And so as I got older, I wanted to piece together the family stories I heard into the larger narrative of Ukrainian history. And I started there. And as I found out more about that, I learned more about the Holodomor, and I realized that is a story I want to tell. And so through the years, I worked on it when I could, and eventually signed with an agent and an editor. So after all this time for it to come out in the midst of another attack on Ukraine was pretty surreal.
Yeah. Well, can you tell our listeners who might not be familiar with Ukrainian history a little bit about that time period?
Sure. So the Holodomor was a man-made terror famine implemented by Stalin in 1932 and 1933. It killed roughly 4 million Ukrainians, and it was in response to a collectivization. He wanted to take all the farms and the property and the implements and the animals and make them state-owned. And Ukrainians, as we're seeing today, are fiercely independent, and they were not having that. And so they resisted, and so he fought that resistance with a forced famine, with strict measures meant to really decimate Ukraine and push them under his thumb.
And at what point did your great-grandmother come to the United States?
So my great-grandmother and her family fled Ukraine in 1944, and they lived in displaced persons camps for several years before immigrating in 1949.
Oh, my.
And so this isn't my family's story. They didn't,
right,
because it was politically motivated, they didn't live in an area that was heavily affected by the Holodomor. But they did bear witness to people who had survived it, and so those stories trickle down.
Okay. So the novel is actually inspired by your family history, but it tells a different story.
Yes. And my second novel actually will pull from my true family history, the stories from World War II and the refugee story. So that will come out next year. But this novel, once I came across the Holodomor in my research for Ukrainian history, I knew I wanted to start there, even if it wasn't family-based.
Yeah. Now, were you exposed to the history of Ukraine in any of your coursework at SIUE?
No, I actually didn't. I actually leaned more towards American history at that point in my life.
Yeah, because actually one of the fascinating things, I'm listening to you and thinking about my own experience, and I'm a U.S. historian, but as an undergraduate, I actually was very attracted to European history, and took probably more courses in the history of Europe, although not, in those days, which was a while ago, it was not terribly easy to find a lot of courses in U.S. colleges and universities that focus specifically on Eastern Europe.
Right.
So
yeah, that's interesting. Opposite.
A lot of my learning really was sort of inspired by what I learned in my European history classes. But I would then go and pick books off the library shelves and read about, say, for example, the experience of World War II in Kyiv, which was a very brutal experience for many people, particularly civilians.
Yes.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the book, The Memory Keeper of Kyiv, and you don't have to reveal anything that would spoil it for people who might want to read it. But tell us a bit about the plot and the meaning of the book.
Sure. So it's the story about a story about a girl named Katya. She's a young woman coming of age and living in a rural village outside of Kyiv. And she's happy. She's in love with the boy next door. She's got a great family. And then Stalin's activists arrive to collectivize farming. And her world is turned upside down. And so her story is about the choices she makes to survive, the sacrifices she makes, and how those haunt her for the rest of her life. And then the second point of view is her granddaughter, Cassie, who has just come to live with Katya and help her as she nears the end of her life. But she's facing her own tragedy. She just lost her husband in a car accident. Her young daughter hasn't spoken since the car accident, and she has no idea what her grandmother went through. Katya kept it buried, as many people, victims of that tragedy, did, whether for political fear of retribution or because it was too hard to talk about. So as they come together and heal and face their grief and work through it together, Cassie discovers this immense strength in her grandmother that in turn inspires her. So it's a story of family healing and grief and loss and hope and how you can move on.
How did you decide to set it that way rather than just making it all about, Ukraine in the 1930s? How did you decide to set it in the recent past? I
get that question a lot, and I think that part of the book is personally reflective of me. There's a lot I don't know about what my great-grandmother went through. And so to imagine that because she died when I was a child. So to imagine me with her as an adult and having this opportunity to delve into her history and really find out what she went through and bond with her over that. It was just so appealing. And so I wanted to show that aspect of it. And I also wanted to hopefully inspire people to talk to their grandparents, to talk to elderly people and find out what they went through. And I love the connection of past and present. And I think it's something that's far too often overlooked in our society.
Oh, that's great to hear you say that, because one of the things I'm very interested in doing is trying to encourage faculty and students to get out and do more interviewing. And that is important in a lot of our classes in the college, but I think there are places where we could do even more of that and build connections with communities and really hear each other's stories. Because one of the things that has struck me since I've been here, I've talked to a number of people who work for the university who have been very generous in sharing their family stories. Many of them actually migrated to this part of the world from the Deep South in the middle years of the 20th century. And so I love listening to those stories, and I always feel really honored that people will share those stories with me.
Yes, it's definitely a privilege, and I think it makes us better people to know those stories and understand it, foster that empathy. Yeah,
absolutely. So what did you find most rewarding about writing your book?
Well, like I said before, because it was so personal, it really helped me connect with my family, my history, my roots, and it was very special in that delving into that history was personal. Like every word I wrote and every time I edited, I could feel like my great grandmother there with me in a way. And I know it sounds corny to say, but it really did make me feel closer to all of that. So that was very special to me.
Oh wow! Now did you grow up having a real sense that you were part of a broader Ukrainian community?
Not as much as I would have liked, actually. Okay. And I think that might be in part because my grandfather, I think there's a disconnect sometimes when there's a male line that falls through. A lot of the matriarchal line carries on to some of those traditions. So while we did have a lot of the traditions, it wasn't as fleshed out as I would have hoped it to be if she had lived longer into my life.
So that's great to hear that was really rewarding for you. What was the greatest challenge in writing a book, a novel like this?
I think the historical research, as much as I love it and as much as I could get lost in it for hours, it was emotionally draining. This is a really tragic situation, and reading those firsthand accounts, and especially as a mother, thinking about what these parents saw their children go through, or thinking about children losing their parents and being orphaned and alone and having nothing to eat. It was hard. So there were times where I'd have to walk away from it and come back to it with a clearer mind. So that was challenging, but in the same breath, it was vital. And I think that's something in our society we're quite apt to walk away from because we don't want to look at it. We don't want to face it, but it's necessary because those things happened and we need to know about them to make sure they don't happen again.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you were writing, did you have a sense of the story and you were doing the research to fill it in, or were you doing the research and then the story sort of took shape as you?
A bit of both. Okay. A bit of both. So there's definitely, without giving away spoilers, there's definitely some family influence on the dynamics of the family then that I pulled from my family, and I knew I wanted to implement that, and I knew I wanted the scale of loss that I wanted to implement as well. And so then I brought in the research to flesh that out and make it factual as much as you can within a historical fiction. Okay.
Well, that's one of the things I'm really intrigued about, because I've written, I've published one book. I've written drafts of manuscripts of others, but these are historical books which are, they don't involve any fictionalizing at all, although that's also one of those real challenges, is when you find gaps in the historical record and you wish that you could be able to say something about someone's experiences, but you just don't have any sources. And so, I'm asking you these questions to see what it's like to have that freedom to write about something that you can imagine and you can fill in the blanks that the research may not actually provide for you.
And that is nice to have, but I will say there have been many hours wasted on this one situation that I'm like, but could that really have happened? I will pore over books for hours to see, and at the end I'm like, do I even really need that scene? Maybe I can just move on. So yeah, the freedom is great, but I still strive to try and make it as historically accurate as I can.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important part of historical fiction.
Yeah, I agree.
Actually. Yeah. Well, what do you hope readers take from your book?
I hope people will read this book and realize that Ukraine has been through a lot, and they have been fighting for their autonomy for generations, and they're doing it again today. And so they need our support, and the world needs to be behind them. And I hope people will realize that there is a wealth of knowledge to be gained from learning the stories of our past, and appreciate that history and continue to teach it and not hinder it in any of the ways that we've seen happening recently.
No, I think that's a really great point, both in terms of helping people understand the history of places like Ukraine, and particularly Ukraine, which a lot of people I don't think knew very much about the history of the country until the Russian invasion.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, getting to know our own family's histories and acknowledging that there may be things that are very unpleasant or very difficult to deal with in our own personal pasts.
Yes.
But I think as you say, it's really critical for people to come to grips with that and not ignore it or pretend that, well, because it happened in the past, it doesn't have any impact on it.
Absolutely.
On us today.
Well said.
Yeah. So how did it feel when you learned that your novel had been included on the top 10 new page-turning novels you should read this summer list from Fortune magazine?
That was unbelievable. It was pretty exciting. I didn't know about it till I saw it on Twitter one morning, and it was shocked. Yeah, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that must be. I've not had that experience, of course. My book never got those kinds of notices, but I think that's really exciting, and it's one of the things that brought your book to the attention of the college, and led me to. I have to apologize. I haven't finished reading the book, but I have started, and so it's one of those books that I'm intrigued to find out what happens next. So,
thank you for reading.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're working on a second book.
Yes.
And that it's based more on your family's history. Can you tell us a little bit more? Again, without giving away any spoilers, but
yes. So my family fled Ukraine, actually Western Ukraine, which at the time was occupied by Poland, in 1944 as the Soviet front advanced and the Germans retreated. And so they left in a wagon and traveled west and ended up staying in DP camps for several years. And so I'm pulling stories that I heard from my great-grandmother from that and creating a fictional family. And then as a counterpoint to that, I'm going to be exploring the forced labor movement that Germans employed millions of Soviets and Ukrainians and Polish people.
Oh, wow.
So.
Okay. Will it be a similar kind of book in terms of the,
No.
okay.
No, it's going to be all set in the 1940s.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Veering off that a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I had a good friend in graduate school who wrote about the displaced persons camps, and so I have some knowledge of the camps and the conditions in the camps, and I'm glad that you pointed out that people could live there for years.
Yes.
That there was so much devastation in the areas that had been invaded by the Nazis, and then the counter invasion by Soviet troops that really left people who were civilians in those areas. Many of them were displaced. Many of them just were horribly suffering as they tried to survive in the brutal conditions during and following the war. So, what's beyond this book? Do you have a third novel in mind that you're thinking about?
Tossing around a few ideas with my agent and editor now, but nothing to speak of yet.
Okay. I won't try to get a scoop here. Oh, good.
There will be one down the road.
Well, it sounds as if you really enjoy writing, even though I know it took you a long time to finish this first book. Yeah. But it sounds as if it's been a very rewarding experience for you, and you've decided that that's what you're going to spend most of your time on. Yes, this next book won't take 10 years. I have a deadline now, so it's going to be a much more expedient process moving forward. Okay, so does your agent give you the deadline, or does the publisher say this is when we need the manuscript, and then you
So my first deal was a 2-book deal. So I have a deadline for the second book from my editor.
Okay.
And then book 3, we'll see what happens with that.
Okay. Do you think that the third book will also deal with Eastern Europe, or do you think it might?
Possibly.
Okay.
I might have at least one more story in me about that. So we'll see. It's definitely one of the options.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess I'm in a way I'm wondering if you might return at some point, because I mean the Memory Keeper of Kyiv does include a U.S. story, a more contemporary U.S. story, and since you mentioned that you've focused a bit more on U.S. history when you were a student here, I'm wondering if you might return to the United States and write.
Yes, some of my ideas are definitely for U.S.-based history stories.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
So it's kind of figuring out which way I need to go career-wise now or versus later to delve into that different area.
Sure. Okay. Well, where can listeners go to find your book?
I will actually be at the Edwardsville Book Festival this Saturday at the library downtown, signing books there. Copies are also available at the Novel Neighbor in St. Louis, and then through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, anywhere books are sold, can be ordered too. Okay.
So listeners can actually show up and have a book signed.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I'll be selling books there.
Great. Well, I always like to end interviews by asking my guests to offer a little bit of advice. So what advice would you give to a student or a prospective student considering a career as a writer?
Persevere. It took me a long time, but it can happen for anybody if you persevere and keep learning your craft and don't give up.
Oh, wow. That sounds like great advice. It certainly extends beyond just writing as well, but
yes.
in many pursuits, perseverance, I think, is critical. Well, thank you so much, Erin Litteken, for talking with us about your experiences, your writing, and your book, The Memory Keeper of Kyiv. I look forward to reading more of your work, and I look forward to hearing more about you. And for our listeners, thank you for joining us. Stay safe and take care.
This has been Segue, a production of the Department of Mass Communications at Southern Illinois University Edwardsville. All rights reserved.